our story actually begins in the year 2006. That's when the US imposed an arms embargo on Venezuela. The country was cut off from Western weapons. So who did they turn to? The Russians and the Chinese.
Something is happening in South America right now that most people aren't paying attention to. While everyone's focused on other global issues, a chess game is playing out. One that involves Venezuela, Colombia, Mexico, and the future of an entire continent. And the moves being made right now could reshape the Western Hemisphere in ways we haven't seen since the Cold War. April 2013, Venezuela is in the middle of a political crisis that's been decades in the making. Nicolás Maduro's government claims victory in contested elections. The opposition claims fraud. And while this internal struggle plays out, something bigger is emerging. A pattern of statements, threats, and diplomatic pressure that suggests the situation is about to escalate far beyond Venezuela's borders. This is not just about one country anymore. This is about regional dominance, economic control, and a question that hasn't been asked this directly in over a century. Who controls the future of Latin America? Let's start with what's actually happening in Venezuela right now, because you can't understand the bigger picture without seeing how this crisis became the catalyst. Venezuela was once the wealthiest country in South America. They have the largest proven oil reserves on Earth, more than Saudi Arabia, more than Russia. Enough oil to power the world for decades. In the 1950s and 60s, Venezuela was thriving. Modern cities, strong currency, educated population. They called it the Saudi Arabia of the West. Then came the socialist revolution. Hugo Chavez took power in 1999, promising to redistribute wealth and end inequality. He nationalized the oil industry, seized private businesses, and used oil revenue to fund massive social programs. When oil prices were high, it worked. Money flowed. Programs expanded. Chavez became a hero to millions. But when oil prices crashed in 2014, the entire system collapsed. Venezuela had built everything on a single commodity. No diversification, no backup plan, just oil. And when the money stopped flowing, everything fell apart. Nicolás Maduro inherited this disaster in 2013. And instead of reforming, he doubled down. More nationalization, more government control, more currency printing. The result was predictable. Hyperinflation, economic collapse, mass starvation. By 2019, inflation hit 1,000,000%. A cup of coffee that cost 2 bolivars in 2013 cost 20 million bolivars in 2019. The currency became worthless. 7 million Venezuelans have fled the country. That's nearly 25% of the population. The largest refugee crisis in the Western Hemisphere. People walking thousands of miles to Colombia, Brazil, Peru, anywhere to escape. And those who stayed faced daily struggles for food, medicine, basic survival. But here's what most people don't understand. This isn't just an economic crisis. This is a geopolitical crisis with global implications. Because Venezuela's oil is still in the ground, and everyone knows it. That oil represents leverage, power, and the future of global energy markets. And the question of who controls it has become the central issue. The 2024 elections in Venezuela were supposed to be a turning point. International observers, opposition unity, hope for change. But when the votes were counted, or allegedly counted, Maduro declared victory. The opposition said the results were fabricated. They presented evidence of fraud, thousands of voting records showing they won by a landslide. The international community split. The United States, European Union, and several Latin American countries refused to recognize Maduro's victory. They recognized the opposition as the legitimate government. But Russia, China, Iran, Cuba, they backed Maduro. And suddenly, Venezuela became a proxy battleground. Two governments, both claiming legitimacy. One controlling the country, the other recognized internationally. And both sides digging in for a confrontation. Now here's where it gets interesting. Because in January 2026, the Trump administration, back in power, made a series of statements that changed the entire dynamic. Not just about Venezuela, but about the region. The statements were direct. Venezuela's government is illegitimate. The opposition should be recognized. And then came the part that sent shockwaves through every capital in South America. The suggestion that if regional governments don't cooperate, if they don't align with U.S. interests, there could be consequences. Colombia was mentioned specifically. President Gustavo Petro, a former guerrilla fighter turned politician, has maintained diplomatic relations with Maduro's government, not because he supports Maduro, but because Colombia shares a 1,400-mile border with Venezuela and has absorbed millions of refugees. Colombia needs stability in Venezuela, not regime change chaos. But those pragmatic calculations don't align with the new approach. The message from Washington was clear. You're either with us or you're part of the problem. Mexico was next. President Claudia Sheinbaum, who took office in 2024, has maintained Mexico's traditional policy of non-intervention. Mexico doesn't take sides in other countries' internal affairs. It's been their diplomatic position for decades. That position is now being challenged. The suggestion that Mexico's neutrality is unacceptable, that remaining neutral is the same as supporting Maduro, and that there could be economic consequences, diplomatic pressure, or worse. Cuba, already under decades of embargo, was mentioned as a country that looks ready to fall. The implication was clear. The governments we don't like in this hemisphere are on notice. Change is coming, whether they want it or not. Now, let's be very clear about what's actually being discussed here, because there's a difference between diplomatic pressure and military intervention, between economic sanctions and regime change, between supporting opposition groups and direct involvement. The language used suggests a return to a very old doctrine, one that most people thought was left in the 20th century. The idea that the United States has a right, even a duty, to determine what governments are acceptable in the Western Hemisphere. This isn't new. It's been U.S. policy, officially or unofficially, for over 200 years. The Monroe Doctrine, declared in 1823, said that any European interference in the Americas would be considered a threat to U.S. security. It was about keeping European powers out, but over time, it evolved into something else: justification for intervention. In 1954, the CIA helped overthrow Guatemala's democratic government because they were implementing land reform that affected U.S. corporate interests. In 1961, the Bay of Pigs invasion attempted to overthrow Castro in Cuba. It failed, but the intent was clear. In 1973, the U.S. supported a coup in Chile that replaced the elected socialist president with a military dictatorship. In the 1980s, the U.S. funded Contra rebels in Nicaragua, armed governments in El Salvador and Guatemala, invaded Grenada and Panama. The pattern was consistent. Governments that didn't align with U.S. interests were targeted for removal by economic pressure, covert action, or direct military force. After the Cold War ended, this approach was supposed to change. Democracy, international law, multilateral cooperation. The 21st century was supposed to be different. And for a while, it seemed like it was. Latin American countries elected their own leaders, pursued their own policies, and the U.S. mostly stayed out of it. But now, something is shifting. The language is changing. The approach is becoming more direct, and the implications are massive. So why now? Why is Venezuela the catalyst for this broader regional confrontation? There are several factors at play, and they're all converging at the same time. First, energy. Venezuela has 304 billion barrels of proven oil reserves. That's more than anyone else. But under Maduro, production has collapsed. Venezuela was producing 3 million barrels per day in the 1990s. Today, it's under 800,000. The infrastructure is decaying, the expertise has fled, and the oil stays in the ground. From a strategic perspective, that's wasted potential. If Venezuela's oil production could be restored, it would reshape global energy markets. It could reduce dependence on Middle Eastern oil, provide leverage against Russia, and generate enormous wealth. The question is, who controls that process? Second, China. Over the past 20 years, China has invested billions in Latin America. Infrastructure projects, loans, trade deals. Venezuela owes China over $20 billion. China has been patient, betting that eventually things will stabilize and they'll get access to Venezuelan oil. If Maduro falls and a pro-U.S. government takes over, those Chinese investments could be at risk. The new government might renegotiate contracts, prioritize U.S. companies, or simply default on Chinese debt. It's a geopolitical chess move, removing Chinese influence from America's backyard. Third, migration. The Venezuelan refugee crisis has destabilized the entire region. Colombia has taken in 2.5 million refugees. Brazil over 500,000, Peru, Chile, Ecuador, all dealing with massive influxes. This creates social tension, economic strain, and political pressure. The argument is that the only way to stop the refugee crisis is to fix Venezuela. And the only way to fix Venezuela is regime change. Maduro won't reform. Sanctions haven't worked. So the options are either accept permanent instability or force a change. Fourth, domestic politics. In the United States, being tough on Venezuela plays well with key voting blocs: Cuban Americans, Venezuelan Americans, anti-socialist conservatives. Promising to confront Maduro, support democracy, and restore order is good politics. But it's also risky politics. Because what happens if the confrontation escalates? What happens if economic pressure doesn't work? What happens if Maduro doesn't fall? This is where the mentions of Colombia and Mexico become significant. Because they're not just about Venezuela. They're about establishing a regional framework. The idea that all countries in the hemisphere need to align with U.S. policy. That neutrality isn't acceptable. That there's a new sheriff in town, and everyone needs to fall in line. Colombia's position is particularly delicate. They share the longest border with Venezuela. They've absorbed the most refugees. They have ongoing peace negotiations with remaining guerrilla groups. They need stability, not chaos. President Petro has been trying to maintain a balance, criticize Maduro without supporting intervention, call for democratic solutions without breaking relations. But that middle ground is being challenged. The pressure is to pick a side completely. Mexico's position is different but equally complex. Mexico has always maintained that non-intervention is a core principle. They don't support coups. They don't take sides in other countries' elections. It's been their policy through every administration, left or right. But now that policy is being tested. The suggestion that Mexico needs to actively support regime change in Venezuela, that remaining neutral makes them part of the problem, and that there could be consequences for not cooperating. What consequences? That's the question everyone is asking. Economic sanctions, trade restrictions, diplomatic isolation. The language is deliberately vague enough to create uncertainty, and uncertainty is a form of pressure. Here's what makes this moment different from past interventions. The world is watching. Social media means everything is documented, broadcast, analyzed in real time. International law has evolved. Regional organizations like the Organization of American States exist to mediate these disputes. But more importantly, Latin America itself has changed. These aren't the military dictatorships of the Cold War. These are democracies with their own interests, their own populations, their own sovereignty. And they're not going to simply follow orders from Washington. Brazil, the largest country in South America, has been notably absent from the confrontation. They've called for dialogue and negotiation. Argentina, under its new libertarian president, has taken a harder line against Maduro. Chile and Uruguay have tried to maintain regional unity. The result is a fractured response. No unified position. No clear path forward. Just competing interests, competing visions, and a growing sense that something is about to break. So what are the possible scenarios here? How does this actually play out? Scenario 1. Economic pressure succeeds. Maduro's government, already weakened by years of sanctions and economic collapse, finally breaks. The military switches sides. Maduro goes into exile. The opposition takes power. Venezuela begins rebuilding. Refugees start returning. Oil production restarts. It's a clean victory for regime change policy. But there are problems with this scenario. Maduro has survived 25 years of pressure. He has support from Russia, China, Iran, Cuba. He controls the military and security forces, and he knows that losing power could mean prison or worse. He's not going quietly. Scenario 2. Military intervention. If economic pressure fails, if the crisis deepens, if refugee flows increase, there could be calls for direct action, not a full-scale invasion, but special operations, support for opposition forces, or a coalition of regional powers going in. This is where it gets extremely dangerous. Because Venezuela isn't Iraq or Libya. It's in the Western Hemisphere. It has powerful allies. And military intervention in Latin America would trigger reactions across the globe. Russia and China would respond. Regional governments would face massive domestic opposition. The entire framework of international law would be challenged. Scenario 3. Negotiated settlement. Behind the scenes, pressure leads to a deal. Maduro agrees to step down in exchange for guarantees. The opposition agrees to include some Chavistas in a transitional government. International observers oversee new elections. It's messy, but it prevents catastrophe. This is probably the best-case scenario. But it requires Maduro to believe he's truly cornered. It requires the opposition to compromise. And it requires international guarantees that everyone actually trusts. Right now, that trust doesn't exist. Scenario 4. Long-term stalemate. Nothing changes. Maduro stays in power. The opposition remains in exile. Sanctions continue. The humanitarian crisis continues. And every few years, there's another confrontation, another crisis, another threat that doesn't quite materialize. This might be the most likely scenario, because regime change is much harder than it looks. And the alternatives are all risky, expensive, and unpredictable. But here's what's really happening beneath all of this. This isn't just about Venezuela. This is about whether the United States can still dictate outcomes in Latin America, whether regional countries have true sovereignty or whether they're expected to follow Washington's lead, whether the 19th century Monroe Doctrine still applies in the 21st century. And the answer to that question has implications far beyond this hemisphere. Because if the U.S. can pressure Colombia and Mexico, if it can threaten regime change in Venezuela, if it can establish that alignment is mandatory, then what does that mean for the international order? China is watching. Russia is watching. Every country in the developing world is watching. Because the precedent being set here applies everywhere. If sovereignty can be overridden when governments don't align with superpower interests, then sovereignty doesn't mean anything. This is the real crisis. Not just the humanitarian disaster in Venezuela, although that's real and terrible. Not just the refugee flows, although those are destabilizing the region. The real crisis is the question of what rules apply in the international system and whether power or principle determines outcomes. Venezuela is the test case, a failing state with enormous oil reserves, caught between competing powers, being used as a proxy for broader struggles. The people suffering there are real. The economic collapse is real. The need for change is real. But the solution being proposed, pressure, threats, regime change, carries its own risk. What happens if it fails? What happens if it succeeds but creates chaos? What happens if Colombia and Mexico refuse to cooperate? What happens if China and Russia respond? These aren't theoretical questions anymore. They're being answered in real time. January 2026 might be remembered as the month when the post-Cold War order in Latin America ended, when the U.S. decided that soft power and diplomacy weren't enough, when the threats became explicit. Or it might be remembered as a moment when the threats were made but nothing happened, when the bark was worse than the bite, when the limits of American power became clear. We don't know yet. We're living through it. But what we do know is this. The situation in Venezuela is not isolated. It's connected to Colombia, to Mexico, to Cuba, to every country in the region. It's connected to U.S.-China competition, to global energy markets, to the future of sovereignty and international law, and the moves being made right now. The statements, the threats, the pressure, they're setting the stage for what comes next. Whether that's resolution or escalation, negotiation or confrontation, we're about to find out. The people of Venezuela deserve better than what they've endured. They deserve a functioning economy, a legitimate government, a future. But how that future arrives, through internal change, external pressure, or something in between, that question is now caught up in forces much larger than Venezuela itself. What's happening in South America right now is a chess game. The pieces are moving, the strategies are forming, and the outcome will determine not just Venezuela's future, but the future of an entire region. The question is whether anyone is actually thinking 3 moves ahead, or whether everyone is just reacting, hoping for the best, and risking outcomes no one really wants. Because in chess, as in geopolitics, sometimes the aggressive move wins, and sometimes it triggers a cascade of consequences that no one saw coming. Venezuela, Colombia, Mexico, Cuba, they're all pieces on the board now, and the game is in motion. If this helped you understand what's actually happening beyond the headlines, what the real stakes are, and why this matters for the entire hemisphere, make sure you're subscribed, because this situation is developing fast. And understanding the patterns, the history, and the competing interests is how you see what's coming next before it arrives. But there's something else happening here that nobody is talking about openly. The timing. Why January 2026? Why now? Venezuela has been in crisis for years. The disputed election happened months ago. But the aggressive statements, the explicit threats to Colombia and Mexico, all of that started at the exact moment the new administration took office. That's strategy, not coincidence. Look at the sequence. First, Venezuela is illegitimate, expected, but then Cuba gets mentioned. Looks like it's ready to fall. That's not diplomatic language. That's intention. Then Colombia gets warned. Then Mexico. Both being told their current positions aren't acceptable. This is pressure testing. Seeing who pushes back. Seeing who falls in line. Because if Colombia and Mexico comply, if they align fully despite their own interests, then every other country in the region knows where they stand. Submit or face consequences. Here's the wild card. Venezuela's military. Regime change only works if the people with guns switch sides. And right now, Venezuela's military remains loyal to Maduro, not from ideology, but self-interest. The top military leadership controls drug trafficking routes, oil smuggling operations, criminal enterprises. They're not fighting for socialism. They're fighting to stay out of prison. If Maduro falls, they fall. So they have every every incentive to keep him in power, but they also have every incentive to cut a deal if the situation becomes hopeless. Guarantees of immunity, safe passage, financial security. That's how coups happen, when generals decide their best chance of survival is switching sides. The question is, what would trigger that calculation? Economic collapse hasn't done it. Sanctions haven't done it. Popular protests haven't done it. So what would actually work? That's being calculated right now in Washington, Caracas, Havana, Moscow, Beijing. And this is where it becomes genuinely dangerous. Because when conventional pressure doesn't work, the options get more extreme. Covert action, support for armed opposition, special operations, the toolkit of regime change that has been used before, often with catastrophic results. There's another layer most analysis misses: the economic spillover. Colombia has spent billions managing Venezuelan refugees. Their healthcare, education, social services, all strained beyond capacity. Brazil, Peru, Ecuador, Chile, all overwhelmed. Every country in the region is dealing with Venezuela's collapse. When the U.S. says we need to solve the Venezuela problem, there's actually regional support for that goal. Not for the methods, but for the outcome. Nobody wants permanent crisis. The question is how to end it without making things worse. This creates leverage. If Colombia and Mexico can be convinced that cooperating is the fastest path to ending the refugee crisis, they might go along. Not because they agree with the approach, but because they're desperate for solutions. But the U.S. has a long history in Latin America of promising solutions and delivering chaos. Guatemala, Chile, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Panama, Haiti. The list of interventions that didn't go as planned is long. Everyone in Latin America remembers. The distrust is earned. What makes 2026 different is China and Russia. China is now Latin America's second largest trading partner. Billions invested in infrastructure, mining, agriculture, technology. They're integrated into the regional economy in ways the Soviet Union never was. Russia, while economically weaker, maintains military relationships. They sell weapons to Venezuela. They conduct joint exercises. They have advisors embedded in Venezuelan security forces. So any move against Venezuela isn't just regional. It's a direct challenge to Chinese and Russian influence. And that creates escalation risks that didn't exist in previous interventions. What happens if Colombia asks China for economic support to resist U.S. pressure? What happens if Mexico diversifies trade as a hedge? What happens if Venezuela, backed into a corner, invites Russian military presence? These escalation spirals can turn regional crises into global confrontations. And once they start, they're hard to control. This is why every move is being watched carefully, because overplaying a hand can trigger responses nobody wants. Right now, we're in the pushing phase. Statements being made, lines being drawn, but nobody has committed to irreversible action yet. There's still room for backtracking, for de-escalation, for off-ramps. The question is whether anyone wants those off-ramps, whether this is about solving Venezuela's crisis or establishing dominance, about humanitarian intervention or geopolitical positioning. Venezuela is the first domino, but Colombia and Mexico are bigger. Behind them are Brazil, Argentina, Chile, the rest of the continent. If the U.S. can pressure Colombia and Mexico into compliance, it sets a precedent. If they resist successfully, it sets a different precedent. The outcome will define hemispheric relations for the next decade. Will Latin American countries maintain sovereignty over their foreign policy? Or will alignment with U.S. positions become a requirement? That's the real question being answered right now. Not in diplomatic statements, but in concrete decisions, in trade negotiations, in security cooperation, in how countries respond to pressure. The world is watching. If the U.S. can pressure its closest neighbors into compliance, what does that mean for other regions? For the entire concept of sovereignty in a multipolar world. This is why Venezuela matters beyond Venezuela. Why these statements and threats echo far beyond the Western Hemisphere. They're testing fundamental questions about power, sovereignty, and international rules. Whatever happens, the shift from quiet diplomacy to explicit pressure, from subtle influence to direct threats, that might be the most significant change. Because once you make threats publicly, you must follow through or lose credibility. You've committed to a path without easy exits. This is the chess game playing out in South America. Multiple players, competing interests, high stakes. Venezuela is the center, but the game extends far beyond it. The outcome will determine not just who governs in Caracas, but what kind of order exists in the Western Hemisphere. Whether sovereignty matters, whether smaller countries have agency, whether might makes right. This is history happening in real time, an inflection point that future historians will mark as when everything changed. We're living through it, watching it unfold, trying to understand where it leads. What happens next depends on decisions not yet made, on how far pressure is pushed, on how much resistance emerges, on whether anyone miscalculates. But one thing is certain, this is not a minor diplomatic dispute. This is a fundamental question about power and order being contested in public view. And how it resolves will shape the world for years to come, not just for Venezuelans, not just for Latin Americans, but for everyone navigating a world where the rules are being rewritten and the question of who has authority to write them is very much up for debate. The chess game is in motion, the pieces are moving, and the endgame is approaching faster than anyone expected. What looks like a regional crisis is actually a global inflection point. The moves are being made right now, and if you know how to read them, you can see exactly where this is headed. Stay informed, stay critical, because this story is far from over.